Hey there! Welcome back to Hunted Dreams. I know many of you tune into these stories to help you drift off to sleep. So before you get too cozy, how about leaving a comment to share where you're listening from around the world? And if you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's story. Chapter 3: Whispers in the Halls. The first few days at the Overlook Hotel were marked by a strange, unsettling rhythm. The grand, old hotel seemed to breathe with a life of its own, revealing its presence in subtle yet disturbing ways. Jack Torrance, the newly appointed caretaker, was eager to dive into his writing, seeing this as his golden opportunity to complete his play, a work he hoped would revive his struggling career. Every morning, after a quick breakfast with his wife Wendy and their son Danny, Jack would retreat to the grand ballroom, setting up his typewriter on an old, sturdy table that overlooked the snowy landscape beyond the large, arched windows. The ballroom was immense, its high ceilings and glittering chandeliers exuding an air of faded elegance. One could almost imagine the ghosts of the past, dressed in their finest attire, dancing across the floor to the haunting strains of a waltz. But now, the room was empty, the echoes of footsteps long gone, leaving only the faint creak of wooden floorboards and the soft tap of Jack's typewriter keys. The vastness of the ballroom should have been inspiring, but instead, it felt oppressive, as though the room itself were swallowing him whole, scattering his thoughts like dry leaves in the wind. As the days passed, Jack found it increasingly difficult to put words on the page. The inspiration that had filled him upon arrival seemed to vanish, leaving behind a hollow frustration. He would stare at the blank page, fingers poised over the keys, but the words refused to come. It felt as if the hotel itself was draining his creativity, replacing it with a gnawing irritability that he couldn't shake. His thoughts grew darker, more disjointed, and with each passing day, he found himself snapping at Wendy and Danny over the smallest things. Wendy, always the peacemaker, tried to make the best of their situation. The isolation of the Overlook was daunting, but she hoped the time away from the outside world would bring their family closer together. She spent her days exploring the hotel with Danny, trying to make the place feel more like home. They would wander through the hotel's many rooms, some of which seemed to stretch on endlessly, filled with dust-covered furniture and the lingering smell of age. Wendy did her best to keep the atmosphere light, turning their explorations into games, but even she couldn't ignore the oppressive silence that filled the halls. It was as if the very air had weight, pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. At times, she would catch a movement out of the corner of her eye, a shadow slipping just out of view, or a door swinging open on its own. She would tell herself it was nothing, just the wind or her imagination, but deep down, she knew something wasn't right. One afternoon, while exploring the west wing of the hotel, Wendy and Danny came across a long hallway lined with old photographs. The pictures were black and white, capturing moments from the hotel's storied past, grand balls, elegant dinners, and famous guests. The faces in the photographs stared out at them, their expressions frozen in time. But something about those faces made Wendy's skin crawl. It was as if the people in the pictures were alive, watching them with eyes that held secrets they would never share. Danny, usually curious and eager to explore, seemed subdued. He clung to Wendy's side, his small hand clutching hers tightly as they walked through the hotel. He had always been a sensitive child, with a knack for sensing things that others couldn't. But here, in the Overlook, his sensitivity had become a curse. The hotel whispered to him in a language he didn't understand, filling his mind with images and sounds that left him frightened and confused. At night, Danny's dreams were plagued by visions of dark corridors and rooms filled with shadows. He would wake up in a cold sweat, the whispers still echoing in his ears. He tried to tell his mother about the things he saw, the things he felt, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain the sense of dread that hung over him like a dark cloud, or the feeling that something terrible was waiting for them in the hotel's depths? Wendy noticed the change in Danny, how he had become quieter, more withdrawn. She tried to comfort him, to reassure him that everything was fine, but her words felt hollow even to her. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone in the Overlook, that the hotel was watching them, waiting for the right moment to reveal its true nature. The shadows in the corners seemed to grow darker with each passing day, and the silence that filled the hotel was no longer just silence. It was a presence, a living thing that stalked them through the halls. On the fourth night, Danny finally ventured out on his own, unable to resist the pull of the hotel's dark mysteries. Wendy had fallen asleep early, exhausted from another day of trying to keep the creeping fear at bay. Jack was still in the ballroom, battling his writer's block, the typewriter keys clacking out a rhythm that was more frustrating than productive. Danny waited until the house was quiet, the only sound the soft rustle of the wind against the windows, before slipping out of bed. The hallway outside their suite was bathed in pale moonlight, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out like fingers, beckoning him forward. Danny's heart pounded in his chest, but he wasn't afraid, at least, not in the way he should have been. The hotel had a strange hold on him, drawing him deeper into its labyrinthine halls with a promise he couldn't quite comprehend. He wandered through the corridors, his small feet barely making a sound on the thick carpet. The walls seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing darker, more tangible. He passed by the closed doors of the guest rooms, each one identical yet somehow different in a way he couldn't put into words. Some doors seemed to hum with energy, as if something, or someone, was waiting just behind them, watching him with unseen eyes. Eventually, he found himself standing in front of room 237. The door was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness peeking out from the crack. Danny stared at it, a cold dread settling in his stomach. He had passed this room before during the day, and something about it had always made him uneasy. But now, in the dead of night, it seemed to pulse with a life of its own, drawing him closer. Danny hesitated, his hand hovering just inches from the door. The air around him felt thick, heavy, as if the hotel itself were holding its breath. The silence was absolute, so deep that he could hear the pounding of his own heart, the blood rushing in his ears. He knew he shouldn't go inside, that whatever was in that room was something he was not meant to see. But he couldn't stop himself. Something inside him, some dark curiosity, urged him to push the door open. The door creaked loudly in the stillness, the sound echoing down the hallway. The room beyond was dark, the only light coming from the window, where the moonlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting an eerie glow. The air was stale, filled with the scent of old flowers and something rotten, something that made Danny's stomach turn. He stepped inside, his small body trembling with a fear he couldn't fully understand. The room was like any other hotel room. Neatly made bed, a dresser, a chair by the window. But there was something wrong, something deeply unsettling about the space. The shadows seemed to move, to shift and twist, as though they were alive, watching him. The room was too quiet, too still, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Danny's eyes were drawn to the bathroom door, which was slightly ajar, just like the door to the room had been. A low, humming noise filled the air, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the walls. It was rhythmic, almost like the beating of a heart, growing louder with each passing second. Danny's breath caught in his throat as he took a step closer to the door, his hand reaching out to push it open. The bathroom was dark, the mirror above the sink reflecting the faint light from the bedroom. But something was wrong with the reflection. It was distorted, twisted, as though the mirror were warping the image of the room. Danny blinked, trying to clear his vision, but the image remained. Dark shapes moving in the reflection, shapes that weren't there in the real world. He stared at the mirror, his heart pounding in his chest. The shapes began to take form, growing clearer, more defined. They were figures, shadowy, indistinct, but unmistakably human. They moved across the mirror, their movements slow and deliberate, like dancers in a macabre ballet. Danny's breath hitched as he realized they were looking at him, their eyes, glowing with an unnatural light, locked onto his own. One of the figures reached out, its long, thin fingers brushing against the glass. The mirror rippled like water, the surface bending and warping as the figure pressed closer. Danny could feel a cold dread rising in his chest, his instincts screaming at him to run, to get as far away from that room as possible. But he couldn't move, his feet rooted to the spot as he watched the shadowy figure emerge from the mirror, its form solidifying into something more real, more tangible. The figure stepped out of the mirror, its body pale and dripping with water, as though it had just emerged from a dark, icy lake. Its eyes were hollow, empty voids that seemed to suck the light from the room. Danny's breath came in short gasps, his body trembling with fear as the figure moved toward him, its bony fingers reaching out to touch his face. He couldn't scream, couldn't move, as the cold, wet fingers brushed against his skin. The touch was icy, sending a jolt of fear through his body. The figure leaned in closer, its face just inches from his own. Danny could see the darkness swirling in its eyes, a darkness that promised nothing but pain and despair. Just as the figure's hand tightened on his arm, a loud crash echoed through the room. The spell was broken, and Danny was finally able to move. He jerked away from the figure, stumbling back toward the door. The figure let out a low, guttural moan, a sound that sent chills down Danny's spine. He didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and ran, his feet pounding against the floor as he fled from the room, the door slamming shut behind him with a force that shook the walls. Danny ran through the dark corridors, his heart racing as he tried to put as much distance between himself and room 237 as possible. The hotel seemed to close in around him, the walls narrowing, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. He could hear the whispers again, louder this time, more urgent. They called his name, beckoning him to return, to face whatever horror awaited him in that cursed room. But Danny didn't stop. He kept running, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps as he finally reached the safety of his family's suite. He slammed the door behind him, leaning against it as he tried to calm his racing heart. The whispers faded, the shadows retreating back into the depths of the hotel. But Danny knew they weren't gone. They were still there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. And he knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The Overlook Hotel had awakened, and it wasn't going to rest until it had claimed them all. Thanks for listening to Chapter 3 of our Overlook Hotel series here on Hunted Dreams. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Sweet dreams, and we'll see you in the next episode.